Across all types of media, we share the terms fourth wall and fourth wall break, and what we, the audience, look for in these breaks hardly differs between mediums. When actors within a medium address or make commentary on the boundaries of their scope, that's a fourth wall break. A good example is when letting go of the controller in Sonic CD. After some time, the titular character looks head-on towards the player, staring at them expectantly. After wearing out his patience, he'll jump off screen and promptly end the game.
I'm out of here.
Or how about in Undertale? If the player chooses to kill Toriel and then try to load a previous save, Flowey chastises them for doing so, escaping the preconceived boundaries of its narrative. In dealing with video games, it's determined whether or not an interaction is fourth wall breaking by its conventionality, a completely arbitrary measurement. Quoting Nell van de Mosselaar, fourth wall breaks occur in video games when the conventional interaction with fictional game worlds and the self-referentiality and self-involvement this entails are somehow disrupted. At face value, every video game breaks the fourth wall every time there's a menu prompt, QuickTime event, tutorial sequence, etc. But players don't qualify these as doing so, mainly because that's a boring, stagnated way to analyze media, and also because teaching players how to play the game is conventional. The reason why 1998's Metal Gear Solid is so memorable compared to other games of the time is because most games weren't expecting their players to physically interact with their consoles, let alone PlayStation titles. Where the PlayStation controller becomes a tool of artistic expression, 1984's Duck Hunt requires a plastic gun to be played. Despite being defined as a wall, there's plenty of opportunities to expand the scope for its application. Back in 2018, I issued the idea that the fourth wall could be a malleable mechanic, both in video games and really any form of media. This observation came about when relating the beginner's guide as a valuable resource to apply to one's own work. One could argue that the writer, Davey Wreden, has constructed a game without a fourth wall due to the nature of the narrator persistently speaking to the player. I disputed that, considering the option to move the fourth wall, we could place it behind the narrator and make him a part of the audience. So, instead of there being no fourth wall, its shattering moment is wholly unorthodox. More on this later. Keep in mind that we're only going to touch on video games here. The interactive nature of the medium allows for these breaks to take many more forms than in traditional media. As Dr. Conway writes, the extra nomadic effort demanded by video games to physically interact instantiates a completely different relationship between product and audience. And as I talk through a host of titles, I want to illustrate that convention sets expectations, and expectations are to be broken. With a limited scope and lacking linguistics on the subject, the perception of the fourth wall should be rebuilt from the ground up, and its practicality given the limelight. The fourth wall isn't a gimmick, it's a tool. Although fourth wall breaks, in of themselves, are a trope, there's always room to dig further down. The trope of games as software is one that aims to push our application of the fourth wall to its proverbial limit. Titles within this trope tell us, uncompromisingly, that these pieces of software are indeed video games. And others may outright pretend to be their own computer systems. Better yet, some games interact directly with the user's system. Most cases will use players' file systems to place answers to puzzles or allow the player to directly interface with the game. One Shot makes frequent use of passcodes that are only discoverable on the player's operating system. Without these passcodes, there's no way to progress. In this case, we see the player needing to leave the bounds of the application window to continue experiencing One Shot's narrative. There are numerous ways to interface with the user experience in this manner. For example, the developers may have players dig through file systems and launch secondary applications, though some games opt to emulate file systems instead. Inscription will copy file names from the player's folders to its own junk files. This pays off in having the player act out the motions of deleting their own files to escalate the narrative. There's also file emulation for the sake of parity across Doki Doki Literature Club and One Shot's console releases, because console players are unable to interact with their file systems the same way that PC players are. These ports maintain the core experience across all platforms. Hence, when attempting to quit Doki Doki Literature Club, the player is booted into a computer terminal. For unfamiliar players, this may be a shocking moment. We can qualify these moments in Dr. Conway's immersion model. This model features 3 distinct worlds: the social world, the operator world, and the character world. Using Dr. Conway's model, the player downkeys from the front stage operator or character world to the backstage operator world, and despite pulling the player out of the immediate narrative, players may become further immersed. But by the nature of tropes, this isn't always successful. The Corridor, by Thomas McKinnon, is a fairly simple narrative about a game designer who doesn't want his game to be played. It's a short, 20-minute experience that, in pursuit of making this video, failed to resonate its ideas. This isn't so much a failing on the game as it is my own failing for knowing exactly what to expect. I contend that unconventionality becomes essential for effective fourth wall breaks. If the design intent is for fourth wall breaks to pull the player deeper into the experience, the conventional, expected fourth wall break performs the opposite. Where One Shot innovates its storytelling through the use of the player's computer, the Corridor can take seasoned players right out of the experience. While it'd be tedious to constantly refer back to the immersion model, keeping it in mind can help contextualize how these breaks can be perceived. The backstage component of each world illustrates the more technical nature of the medium. In contrast, the front stage is being wholly immersed in either the social aspects of the game mechanics, or the narrative. The social world is everything surrounding the game. This goes from browsing forums, wikis, and other media, all the way to curiously watching someone else play the game. Once we get our hands on the game, we enter the operator world. The operator world is immersion in the gameplay, where the backstage is traversing menus, equipping characters, and even changing graphics or gameplay settings. The front stage is actually playing the game and interacting with its mechanics. Finally, the character world is the world of narrative. Are we sifting through information on the screen in the back of our heads, predicting story outcomes and criticizing story beats, or are we experiencing the narrative completely content in the moment? It's important to note that, due to the interactive nature of games, fourth wall breaks aren't initiated solely by media. They can also be initiated by the player. When putting these two ideas together, we come to the two-directional break. Quote, two-directional breaks are situations in which the player is not only addressed, but also invited to participate. Honing in on player-initiated breaks, Mosa Lair spoke with Brandon Play on transgressive play, and how players can mold their gaming experiences through their own intentions when approaching media.
That seems to be a case where, you're engaging with the fictional world, whereas other sorts of transgressive play are seem to be failing to engage with the fictional world or the story as the game designers intended it.
The designers give you a certain possibility for having a certain experience, like Zelda the Wind Waker. It's a very beautiful game with a very nice story, but then you have these speedrunners and they are just looking at ways to break this game. Like, how can we break this game? How can we play it even faster?
At the end of the day, we're dealing with interactive software. Whether intentional or not, it's always going to be possible to escape the intentional bounds of the program. Here, we substantiate the appreciator-initiated fourth wall break. When speedrunners make quick work of a game, they create an experience independent of developer intention. While this example is a deliberate act of intrusion, it's plausible that players can break this fourth wall through their own unintentional actions. Traditionally, games require their players to participate in a mutual effort to subvert the fourth wall. The player advances towards a setup through play. Without the player, there is no payoff. But here we see the player disregard this narrative convention. Other games make their software nature more or less apparent. Instead of blatantly illustrating the self-aware nature of the narrative, other games give us a subtle glimpse into what makes a game. In the Stanley Parable's Not Stanley ending, the conclusion sees the player sitting above the ceiling, staring down at Stanley through the transparent surface. From a technical perspective, the player isn't really out of bounds, but from the artist's intentions, the player is illustrated as being outside of the game. The player stares through a piece of geometry where no face is being drawn. It's here where the player may enter the backstage operator world. It's not explicitly telling us that something's wrong, but the observant, more technically aware players will understand that this is yet another gag in making commentary on video games. We then see games that outwardly project that the player is, in fact, dealing with a software-driven game. This happens briefly across Fez and One Shot. Fez's opening moment is one where Gomez collects the three-dimensional Fez, which subsequently crashes the game. An operating system boot screen takes the place of what was the village. As the player then moves through the game world, we see these glitches manifest into obstacles. Software glitches become a narrative mechanic, and in software, glitches become the antagonist. One Shot precedes this by signifying that the game's world is falling apart through these glitches. These glitches come after the metaphor of the game's light going dark. This light bulb keeps the world alive. Without it, we see Nico and the world they're trying to save meet a tragic end. More importantly, the light bulb allows players to continue playing the game. One Shot's plot revolves around his world being constructed to act as a safe haven, though the software has become sentient and confused of its mission. To climb the final tower, the player must launch a secondary application and overlay it on top of the game window. Here, one must consider the medium of play these breaks take place in. Through the physical media in which we interact with the game, we can get away with some pretty interesting ideas. A standout moment is in Animal Crossing when the player forgets to save their game. In a game so whimsical, having Mr. Rossetti scold you for a simple mistake is jarring compared to the rest of the experience, becoming a standout moment. Juxtaposition becomes a powerful tool for fourth wall breaks, but juxtaposition is more difficult to pull off depending on the medium available. This is where 1998's Metal Gear Solid slides into place. Its breaks are highly effective because of their novelty that push the boundaries of its medium. A large part of why they're novel is because of our preconceived notions of the physical media in which the game is experienced. Going back to the Psycho Mantis fight, there's a particular moment where Mantis requests that the player place down the controller. Mantis then uses simple vibration to move the controller back and forth. Narratively, he's using psychokinesis. And this is a special moment for PlayStation games. Through the inherent medium of the original PlayStation, we see controller vibration become a narrative tool. In Mosellar's words, it breaks with the previously established conventional relation between the real and the fictional. Ultimately, this moment is greater than it could have ever been on the Wii, Switch, Xbox One, or even the PlayStation 5. Developers continue to toy with the barrier of expectations in modern games too. Inscription lulls players deep into a roguelike card game experience before pulling the rug out in favor of a larger ARG narrative. And here we see an extreme example of how toying with expectations can be accomplished. This is a make it or break it moment for Inscription, all dependent on metaludic knowledge. Metaludic knowledge is knowledge that can be gleaned from outside of the game world. If the player is expecting a roguelike card game experience, this moment may be the end of their playthrough. On the contrary, many players appear to love this narrative presentation. Now that we see the extreme, we can look closer at the nuance. Say if we wanted to make players think that the game legitimately broke, we could place our eggs into a single basket. Instead of persistently deploying fourth wall breaks throughout the experience, the developers of Batman Arkham Asylum came up with this. The reason why this works is because it's out of nowhere. The player is merely on their way to Killer Croc's lair, but we end up having this whole boss sequence against Scarecrow. And we know he exists, we know that at some point we'll be confronting him, but this empty hallway isn't where players would expect it to happen. Then, from an immediate perspective, seeing the game freeze up in an uncalled for manner will create a sense of panic in players. They'll think that something is seriously wrong with their game or television. Though Undertale proves that expectations can be broken over and over again. The game starts with an introduction of how its HP and XP systems work, but through the telling of an NPC. If the player chooses to dodge this enemy's initial attacks, they'll pull the curtain back on the reality of the situation. You know what's going on here, don't you? From here we see a continual escalation of game awareness. We can slot the example of killing Toriel at the beginning of this video right here. Once the player completes the game, when trying to reset, Flavi makes a plea with the player. He's scared of what comes next. Likely through intentional design, players will often play the pacifist or neutral routes of the game first, and then the genocide route. This concludes in a spectacular confrontation with Kara, a character unreferenced until now. This character then exceeds the preconceived boundaries of the narrative again, further permanently altering the game. The main issue I see with fourth wall breaks is that conventional factor. So what happens when the tropes of fourth wall breaks become narrative convention? Doki Doki Literature Club is a game I believe can have wildly different narrative impacts. Yes, it's a game self-aware of its software nature, but it's also about mental illness and friends and obsession. To successfully pull off its most dire moments, Doki Doki relies on extreme gore and death to scare the player. Fourth wall breaks are more so used to substantiate the antagonist stronger than the actual brutal acts that are taking place. These breaks are still impactful, but only because they directly impact characters the player cares about. Without the emotional ties to these characters, Doki Doki doesn't hold a lot of substance. More importantly, Doki Doki works because its themes are still unexpected. You know something is wrong with this game, you just don't know what. Doki Doki, much like Inscription, relies on fairly trope-heavy mechanics to sell its narrative style. If players carry transludic knowledge of these tricks relating to multiple other games that an individual may have played in the past, then it stands to reason the intended impact will be significantly dampened. If you know that Max Payne, for example, is going to throw out sarcastic comments about its titular character being inside of a video game, instead of chuckling, the player may just sigh. When these breaks become a convention, you're just left with a bad joke. This is also why breaks can't necessarily stand on their own. Breaks are always going to need to be backed by a strong narrative component. Emotional attachment to characters, an interesting game setting or mechanic, witty commentary, and funny jokes, these all allow for breaking moments to truly shine. But the benefits aren't just felt one way. Where narratives substantiate fourth wall breaks, breaks can also help better substantiate the narrative. Here is where the fourth wall break adjacent examples live. These may be things one could consider to be third wall breaks, if we accept such terms, as they don't directly break the fourth wall but do provide commentary on the medium of the material. This is our primary space for expanding our scope on how we can apply and talk about the fourth wall. While we may not consider these to be fourth wall breaks in those moments where they happen, I argue we should. Providing such affordance allows us to push the needle of discussion forwards, such as in Hi-Fi Rush when Rekka steps on top of her comic border, or when Chai makes a sly comment about a character being a cartoon character. On their own, these are clever jokes, but in practice these become memorable moments in a cartoony video game. In poking fun at our subconscious suspension of disbelief, players can actually become more immersed in the game's other components. I dub the term diegetic break to mean breaks that subtly contribute to the narrative. Mind you, these aren't games as software. Traditionally, we may not view these games as fourth wall breaking at all. But by tunneling down into the deeper ideas of how we abstract real-world ideas into video games, we begin to see the cracks and the limitations. For example, how do we represent something like the sun beaming down in the player's face? The Talos Principle, and many other first and third person games, have this distinct lens flare effect as though the sun is bouncing off of the screen. Stephen Conway writes, "Dirt stuck on the screen implies the user is watching through a camera, or of course, the omnipresent graphical feature of lens flare, again acknowledging the presence of a camera." In most games, this may be a concessional way to translate the sun's impact on visibility to a consumable format. In the Talos Principle, one can see this as yet another part of its world building. It's quickly discernible that the Talos Principle setting is not distinctly on Earth, or at least where the story happens. There's too many things that are off here. One of those being the occasional glitch effect that happens to props around the game world. All of this tells us that we're inside of a simulation, and the end goal is to get out. But we see this sort of push and pull relationship with not only playing the game, but then the narrative also taking place within a digital environment. Eventually, the game does cross the boundary of diegesis by admitting its setting takes place within Crow Team's own game engine in the progress_rep3 email log. Our arbitrary boundaries of the fourth wall become difficult to define while looking at a title like Superhot. The flat version of the game, while taking place within a simulation of sorts, doesn't necessarily breach any concrete on the fourth wall. Like, sure, this is games as software, but we aren't using that knowledge to intrude on the real world in any fashion. Except, possibly, this particular moment. One could speculate that the protagonist of Superhot and its VR version is either its own character or is a stand-in for the player. The player's perspective on this semi-dictates how impactful this particular moment is. Did my character just punch themselves in the head, or did I just punch myself in the head? In the VR version, however, the player gets scarily close to being a one-to-one representation of the protagonist. In VR gaming, there's several layers of dissociation removed. The player is now required to physically interact with the game world from their real-world environment. And in this moment, I'd argue we define this as a fourth wall breaking moment by how closely intertwined the player is with the protagonist. It's not fourth wall breaking unless the player projects themselves as the main character. And even then, Superhot's narrative is self-contained enough to where there's no sense of transmedia bleeding happening. This all takes place within the diegesis. Which brings us to the beginner's guide. This game's narrative is constructed in a way that the fourth wall breaks happen wholly inside of the diegetic narrative. There are three main characters to the story: the player, Davy Reedon, our narrator, and Coda. The path of interaction between these three characters is initially linear. Coda only interacts with Davy, Davy only interacts with the player, and the player only lightly interacts with Davy and the game. Davy narrates directly to the player, talking about his interpretations of Coda's work. It's comparable to a friend sitting next to the player on the couch and providing commentary. But Davy Reedon is a narrative tool. Under traditional interpretation, the beginner's guide lacks any sort of fourth wall since the narrator persistently addresses the player. So here's where we need to definitively move our fourth wall. Dr. Conway's 2010 theory on the magic circle allows for the fourth wall to move inwards or outwards in accordance to what should exist within the diegesis. In this scenario, the circle would contract until Davy is pulled from the diegesis into the non-diegetic world. Whether we want the magic circle to contract or we want to draw a line in the sand for where our fourth wall takes place, we want this fourth wall to sit behind Davy so that he's now part of the audience. What this does is better contextualize the climactic payoff between Davy and Coda's relationship. The relationship strains with these lampposts that Davy defines as an endpoint for Coda, an objective to design towards. Though, come the end of the game, we learn that these lampposts are more symbolic of Davy's influence over Coda. It's not until the end that we learn that these lampposts have had a much bigger impact on Coda than we could have ever known. Here, Coda directly addresses Davy in his work. And this moment is our fourth wall break. It's Davy, who's part of the audience, being called out by the work that he's experiencing alongside the player. Think of if the player had learned that their friend sitting next to them had provided a modified copy of the game without any preemption, or even worse, that they had worked directly on the game. Typically, this would be a fascinating social experience, but in the beginner's guide, it's all contained within the narrative. It's a new way to tell a story. I brought this idea on the beginner's guide's narrative approach to Dr. Conway, and he described this as metalepsis, the crossing or blurring of boundaries between fictional and real worlds. He then cites that this could be an up-key, from a lower world to a higher one. Perhaps we transcend the strict operator world and become fully embraced within the character world. What this shows is that fourth wall breaks don't have to take away from the experience. It's not always a gamble on its effectiveness. Even if the beginner's guide fails to woo its audience, it doesn't shatter any sense of self-containment. The narrative works on its own without needing the pull from the player's real world, but still has plenty to say on its medium of presentation. There's a lot on the table and a lot of research to be done. One could ramble on ad infinitum about their own experiences with and interpretations on the fourth wall. Shockingly, there's not a lot of resources behind truly expanding the applicable use cases of the fourth wall. The way in which players engage and immerse themselves in games differs drastically from the next player. I'd argue that using an objective model defeats the point of placing value on individual player interpretation. It's a theoretical science. A big factor in this equation as well is whether or not the developers of these games intended for these moments to be fourth wall breaks. In some examples, the answer seems quite obvious. Others, the lines get blurry. To get a better idea of where this perspective comes from, I'd recommend reading Mussolaire's journal on the implied designer of digital games. Whether developers or players want to consider these ideas, the fact of the matter is that we already see them executed on. It comes down to how one qualifies them. In tinkering with how players immerse themselves within a story, writers can craft wholly new, exciting narratives. The reason developers have more flexibility in how they use fairly static concepts is because of the need to interact. The distinct difference compared to other types of media substantiates the need for implementation of alternative models of the fourth wall. Because it's not really a wall, is it? It's understandable why Dr. Conway moved away from the magic circle model. It's too restrictive for truly capturing what's happening to the player's experience. Although the immersion model wasn't built necessarily to qualify fourth wall breaks. This back and forth is why games are special. The fact that there's so much room to tell new stories. Where other mediums are standardized to a science, there are numerous ways to make games. Developers can reapply the fourth wall in completely novel ways and reap the benefits of meaningfully expanding their narrative. Even if one doesn't care to view this from the lens of the fourth wall, it's just interesting narrative design. Anyone can take the scope of the fourth wall and contribute to the larger conversation of how players immerse themselves within games and how new storytelling techniques could be introduced to an interactive medium. There's plenty of ideas and terminologies, even outside the scope of this video, that can be used to articulate why certain moments in games stand out so much. Fourth wall breaks are different because they inherently make light of the player's immersion state, pushing away or pulling inwards as developers see fit. All of this is to say that I hope that players continue to see new, innovative fourth wall breaks in the future. Thank you for watching.